Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Natalia Larimer, and I will be the facilitator of this webinar today. Our presenter is Melanie Roth. Thank you for joining ANAB for this complimentary webinar on the importance of soft skills for assessors and auditors. Please note, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the attendance and background noise, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you asked. As stated previously, we are recording this webinar, so if you can't stay through the Q&A portion, you can come back to ANAB's website to listen to the recording at a later date. A little bit about our presenter. Melanie Roth has more than 15 years experience in quality assurance, quality control, and quality management. She has worked in a variety of industries, including chemical, biological, oil and gas, and aerospace, developing quality management systems, including internal audit programs, vendor qualification procedures, and implementation of Lean Six Sigma. She has experience across several standards, including ISO IEC 17025, ISO 17034, and ISO IEC 17043, and is a lead assessor for these standards. Currently, Melanie is a technical products developer with ANAB, responsible for developing and delivering training and talks on a variety of topics, including ISO IEC 17025, cause analysis, internal auditing, and risk-based thinking. And without further delay, Melanie, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Natalia. Again, welcome to our webinar on soft skills. I'm excited to get started and hear what questions you might have for us. We will get to the definition of soft skills in a bit, but first, let's talk about what we are going to learn today. The first takeaway is understanding that both verbal and nonverbal communication are important when working with a client. Communication involves active listening, and attentive and reflective listening ensures that what was said is what was heard and understood. This is important when performing audits or assessments because the auditor or assessor must understand the information being provided in order to document conformity or nonconformity. Next, effective note-taking documents objective evidence and can pinpoint side issues or audit trails. Finally, we will see how soft skills can be used to be empathetic yet get the job done when performing an audit or assessment. Sometimes the message auditors or assessors need to deliver impacts the organization in a negative way. Honing your soft skills will allow you to deliver those messages productively. Soft skills are personal attributes, traits, and behaviors that enable an individual to effectively interact with other people. They are a combination of people, social, and communication skills, as well as personality traits and attitudes. As indicated by the definition, soft skills take time to develop. They represent the personality and background of the individual. Some individuals are better at soft skills than others, but most everyone can gain these soft skills through practice and repetition. Let's talk about some of the specific types of soft skills next. Key soft skills for auditors and assessors include effective communication, active listening, problem solving, and thorough note-taking. There are a lot of other soft skills such as teamwork, dependability, and flexibility, but today we are focusing on these since they specifically relate to the skills needed to effectively and efficiently perform management system audits and assessments. These soft skills are developed and honed by the auditor or assessor through practice and experience to continually improve the audit or assessment process. Additionally, these soft skills go hand in hand with each other and are used by auditors or assessors to gather the objective evidence necessary to complete the audit or assessment. Our first soft skill is effective communication. Communication is key to a successful audit or assessment. Assessors and auditors must be effective communicators with all levels of an organization in order to meet the audit or assessment objectives. When communicating verbally, you want to be assertive in tone while speaking calmly. Use diplomacy. Strive to understand the individuals you are speaking to and be sensitive to their ideas and feelings. Affirmative words and/or sounds encourage the individual to continue talking and also shows that you are paying attention and care about what the person has to say. Be sure that you interview in a direct manner. Ask questions related to the topic of interest, and if additional information is needed, ask for it directly. Simple actions like using a person's name, making eye contact, and actively listening when a person speaks will make the person feel appreciated and also demonstrates interest in the person. Obviously, auditors or assessors need to be respectful when communicating, but they also need to recognize and counter objections based on the requirements being audited or assessed in order to effectively complete the audit or assessment. Now we're going to go over nonverbal communication. Then we'll jump into active listening. Nonverbal communication is as important as verbal communication. The way an assessor or auditor presents during the assessment or audit sets the tone and can impact the willingness of individuals to be open and answer questions. Knowing our effect on the organization being audited or assessed is important. Avoid slouching, maintain open arms, and make eye contact. Crossed arms can come off as angry, upset, or closed off. Maintaining open arms and making eye contact demonstrates interest in the topic at hand and in hearing what the person has to say. Similar to using affirmative words, nod to demonstrate understanding. This encourages the individual to continue providing information. Observe the reactions of others as you are speaking. This can show you if they are confused and need additional information from you, or are nervous and need additional affirmation from you. Avoid looking at the clock. This can demonstrate disinterest in the audit or assessment process. Stay engaged in the process throughout the audit or assessment. And finally, respect personal space. Be aware of social conventions for the culture where the audit or assessment is being performed. Also, think about the environment where the audit or assessment is being performed. If the person being observed is sitting, it is usually best practice to sit also, so that you are not hovering over them while they are performing their work. In conjunction with verbal and nonverbal communication, active listening builds trust and establishes rapport with the client. It also demonstrates interest in the organization and individuals participating in the audit or assessment. There are two components to active listening: attention and reflection. Pay attention to what the speaker is saying. Avoid distractions, such as thinking what you will say next. Reflect on what was said before responding to ensure comprehension. Combining attention and reflection into active listening ensures that what was said is what was heard and understood. This is especially important when performing audits or assessments because interviewing personnel is a big part of that process. Objective evidence can be gathered to support conformity or nonconformity during the process of active listening. A way to hone your active listening skills is to practice and perform interviewing. The best way to actively listen is to ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions typically cannot be answered with a short yes or no. They require the interviewee to answer the question with a narrative of some sort, such as describing the steps in a process or how they perform their assigned responsibilities, or how they have the skills and authorizations to perform the work assigned to them. Also, open questions provide the interviewee the opportunity to discuss in some detail topics they are familiar with, which can make them more comfortable with the interview process. Pay attention to what is being said, then reflect on what was said in order to ask clarifying questions. Clarifying questions are intended to ensure what was said is what was heard and understood. Again, this is important in audits and assessments because the interview process is one way to gather objective evidence needed to document conformity or nonconformity. Reflection also allows you to paraphrase what was said to show understanding. If during this process an issue arises, ensure that you understand what was said before disclosing any issues. Having a solid understanding of the requirements, as well as actively listening, paying attention, and reflecting on what was said, will ensure that the audit or assessment is completed effectively and meets the objectives of the audit or assessment. When it comes to problem solving, auditors or assessors need to be able to understand the requirements and be decisive to resolve issues quickly and effectively. This can sometimes be a difficult soft skill to acquire, but the more familiar you are with the requirements you are auditing or assessing, the easier this soft skill is to hone. Being decisive and basing nonconformities on the requirements will allow the auditor or assessor to be empathetic yet still get the job done. When nonconformities are based on requirements, they are objective, and feelings, emotions, and opinions are taken out of the equation. If issues do arise, resolve those quickly and effectively in order to stay on schedule and move through the audit or assessment criteria efficiently. A big component of problem solving is knowing the organization that you are auditing or assessing. This can be a challenge if it is the first time you are visiting the organization, but you can prepare ahead of time. Read and review the documents and records provided. Visit the company's website before arriving on site. Again, understanding the requirements will also aid in being an effective problem solver. Critical thinking is required when problem solving. Analyze the objective evidence gathered against the requirements to come to a conclusion on conformance or nonconformance for that requirement based on the evidence gathered. Risk is a big part of management system and conformity assessment standards, and therefore is a part of auditing and assessing. Understand the risks related to the processes being audited or assessed in order to reach an audit or assessment conclusion. And finally, report accurately. The audit or assessment report and records must accurately reflect what was observed, reviewed, and documented during the audit or assessment. Speaking about the audit report, you want to take effective notes. Taking notes is your document of proof. Your notes can back you if there are doubts or questions about the items reviewed during the audit or assessment. The notes also document objective evidence to confirm conformity or nonconformity. Taking effective and complete notes is a skill that is learned through practice and review. Don't just rely on your memory to collect objective evidence. Take notes as you are auditing or assessing. Highlight the key points discussed or observed. As with active listening, effective note-taking requires reflection. Have a mechanism to quickly identify any side issues that need to be resolved or areas where additional information is needed. I tend to use a small box next to items where I need to follow up later, so I can check that box once the follow-up has been completed. This is just one way to do it, though. Take time during the audit or assessment to review your notes to ensure side issues are covered to the degree necessary. This will assist in organizing the notes as well as putting the notes into the proper format or forms and records as required. A little technical difficulty there. Okay. For auditors or assessors, effective interaction with others is the cornerstone of what they do. They are representing the certification or accreditation body and need to possess the right soft skills to put a good image out there, as well as complete the audit or assessment activities in the agreed upon time frame. with sufficient objective evidence to attest to conformance. Effective communication will engage others and allow the auditor or assessor to match actual practice with the specific requirements. Effective communication includes the soft skills we discussed today: verbal and nonverbal communication, active listening, problem solving, and effective note-taking. Honing these skills will allow you to improve your auditing or assessing skills. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you've learned a little something new. I'm going to pass the ball back to Natalia to wrap this up and get to your questions.
Thank you, Melanie. Wonderful presentation. We've had a few questions come in, and we will get to those after we discuss some additional resources available for accredited organizations or organizations seeking accreditation. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessment. On ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. These webcasts are typically 5 to 20 minutes long depending on the topic and can be viewed at any time. ANAB also has a blog page with lots of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and others. We're also going to have these webinars monthly. One of the upcoming topics would be related to accreditation of medical laboratories. Next, ANAB uses Heads-Up to send information on to the accredited laboratories as well as accredited certification bodies. These Heads-Up provide updates on documentation, policies, and procedures, as well as general information on accreditation. All of the historical Heads-Up can be found on ANAB website. And finally, ANAB offers training in many areas, including internal auditing, standards, risk, and other topics. As with the assessments, training has changed significantly with the pandemic and travel restrictions. All of our traditional in-person courses have been converted to online versions and include exercises and discussions related to the topic at hand. We also offer web-based, self-paced training. All of these resources can be found on our ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. Now, let's get to the fun part, your questions. Melanie, the first question is, what does it mean to use diplomacy when communicating with others?
That is a good question. So using diplomacy is understanding the people that you're speaking to, being aware of how they fit into the organization and how they do things. Being diplomatic is not putting your own opinions and interpretations into the assessment or audit, but understanding where they're coming from. What are their ideas? What are their feelings? Similar to having empathy, making sure that you're listening to the individual and being respectful of them while they're speaking.
Thank you. Next question. What are some ways that you take notes during the audit? Do you use specific forms or blank paper?
It depends on if you're auditing or assessing for a certification or a accreditation body. If they have specific forms, then you would need to use those. I tend to write very large, so from my perspective, I like to write on blank paper and then transcribe those notes into the appropriate forms throughout the assessment. That also helps me reflect on my notes so that I am doing that reflection and review of the notes. I did mention during the talk that I use little boxes next to things that I need to follow up on. Say I need a record or I need to follow an audit trail. I'll put a box there so that I know that there's something that I need to follow up on, and then I'll check that box when I finish doing that. But I tend to take notes not in line, so using a blank piece of paper allows me to write notes next to notes and not actually go in a sequential order with my notes, but that's just how my brain works.
Awesome. We have one question related on it. I don't know if you want to add anything. And the question is, could you please elaborate a bit on how to take effective notes and should they be part of your audit package?
Taking effective notes is something that you have to learn throughout the audit process. I like to use the example of my very first internal audit that I performed long time ago, where I just wrote down using whiteout, and that was against our company policy to use whiteout. And I didn't write where they were, who they were, what the records were. I just wrote using whiteout, and that taught me that I need to be a little more specific in the notes that I take. You want to take down the key information. So when you're auditing or assessing, you have a requirement and you're trying to determine conformance to that requirement. So think of what is the information that you need to convey in your audit package to say that it was conforming, or in the event that it's not conforming. From an A&AB perspective, we don't collect the assessor's notes, but those notes should be transcribed into the checklist, into the assessment summary report. So those notes should be reflective of that audit package that's turned in. It just depends on the certification or accreditation body rules for that.
Thank you. Next question. Can you discuss a few ways on how to best resolve challenging situations? Example, when you see nonconformity, but the CAB does not agree.
That's another excellent question. This is also something that takes time to hone as a skill. You know, I mentioned during the talk that you need to base your nonconformities on requirements. So there's a requirement and a standard. There is the actual objective evidence from the organization that you've observed, and there's a gap in between that. So really, if your nonconformities are based on the requirements, the CAB cannot agree. The laboratory or the organization cannot agree with that nonconformity or the issue that you've raised. But if there's a specific requirement that they're not meeting, then it's pretty black and white that it is a nonconformity. There are some other avenues that you can take with that. There are appeals processes for audits and assessments. So you can agree to disagree during the audit or assessment, and then they can appeal it if they feel so strongly. The biggest tool that we have as A&AB assessors is to contact their accreditation manager at A&AB and have them weigh in. Here's the requirement. Here's the situation I've observed. Is it a nonconformity or not? But really staying calm under pressure, speaking calmly, being assertive, but not being pushy is another way to deliver the message empathetically, but still being able to deliver that message.
I think we have a lot of interest in that area. Follow-up question. When it comes to communication and performing interviews, what would you consider as the best approach for an individual that is being defensive and or argumentative?
So this does follow up to that last question, because we are delivering messages that they may not want to hear. You know, they have developed their processes, their procedures, their management system, and we may be saying that there's something wrong with it based on the requirements and the observations that we've made. So they can be defensive. I've also found on assessments that people are defensive because they're nervous. They're not defensive by nature, but they're really nervous, and they think that we're coming in to, I've had people say, you're coming in to shut me down. And if we take a positive attitude as auditors and assessors, and we use that nonverbal communication of maintaining open arms and making eye contact and observing their reactions, we can kind of counter that. I have run into the situation where somebody was just, I don't want to say combative, but they were very defensive. And I just explained to them that there are requirements that they need to meet, and I need to show how they're meeting it. I'm not there to tell them what they're doing wrong. I'm there to confirm what they're doing right. And a lot of times that will take people down a little bit to say, I'm here from a positive aspect. I'm here to document how you're meeting the requirements. And if there's a space where you're not, then we can talk about that. But I always go into an assessment or an audit assuming conformance, and sometimes that will help with the attitude of the auditee.
Thank you. Next question, again on interviews. The hardest thing that I have found during interviews is being caught off guard with a response and then quickly trying to think about the next question to ask. Do you have any suggestions on how to redirect the conversation back to the subject or topic with the response when the response is unrelated?
Yeah, so we are dealing with individuals, and sometimes they will redirect the conversation so that they don't have to answer the question, but sometimes they may not understand the question. So if I get a response that I wasn't expecting or that takes us off the topic that I'm trying to assess or audit, then I will just say, let me ask that in a different way. Or I'll say, give me a second to think of my next question, or ask for a record to review so I can think about what I want to say next. We talked about don't think about what you want to say next when you're interviewing somebody. Listen to what they're saying. You have questions that you want to ask ahead of time, but try not to be thinking of what you're going to say next while they're speaking so that you can get the information from them and be able to write that down in your notes. But yes, that is one thing to just say, let me rephrase that question. And there are times that I have just moved on to another area, put a little box on my notes to say I'll come back later and find a different way to ask that question later. You've got a lot to cover during an audit or assessment, so you can certainly take a left turn and move on to something else and then come back to that person later.
Okay, next question. For active listening, attention and reflection are two components. Oftentimes, I find that in the moment of the interview or discussion, that it is hard to really reflect on the information and that this reflection comes later. Any suggestions on how to incorporate the reflection aspect sooner?
Take your time. Be okay with silent moments. We do have an audit schedule to follow, but when you're speaking with somebody and they've said something to you and you need to absorb it, just take a moment. Just say, let me reflect on what you just said. Say it out loud, and then just reflect on what they've said. Take your notes, and then continue on. I like talking, and I typically talk fast. I try to make myself not talk fast for webinars. So I have to be okay with silence. So it's okay to take a moment, think about what they said, and if they start getting uncomfortable with the silence, then just say, I'm reflecting on what you said. The point that you made there is the reflection also comes later because you are also reflecting on your notes. So you may reflect on it in the moment, go back and review your notes, and have additional questions. It's okay to go back to that person and ask them additional questions.
Wonderful. Next one. Assertiveness is important, but can also be a barrier to building trust and rapport. What is the best approach to find the balance?
These are really excellent questions. Assertiveness can be a challenge. You don't want to come off as pushy or controlling, but you want to control the assessment or the audit, and you want to be assertive in that you have an objective to meet. You need to document conformity or nonconformity for the requirements that are assigned for that audit or assessment criteria. So you have to be in control of the moments during the assessment. You can also balance that, though, if you do have another strong-willed person, by allowing them to speak about something that they want to speak about. Let them go for a few minutes and then be assertive and bring that conversation back to the audit or assessment objectives.
Fantastic. There's another question that came in on note-taking. Could you give some more information on effective note-taking, especially when you find yourself in a situation where it is difficult to write everything down? goes back to communication as well. Basically, how to take effective notes during an interview versus when you're watching someone to the task. Hard to take notes and keep an eye contact and capture everything you need to see.
That's a lot of information in one question. So let me unpack it a little bit and go with the first one about effective note-taking where it's difficult to write everything down. This is something that you learn over time as you perform more audits or assessments. You start to learn what is the key information that you need in order to document conformity or nonconformity. So you need to write down the lot numbers. You need to write down if they're following their process or not. You don't necessarily need to write each step of the process because you should have a procedure that you can review later. So it's really documenting that key information and what you need to document in order to say that they are conforming to the requirements. Also, what was I going to say? A situation where it's difficult to write everything down in a timely manner. You can paraphrase, again, just write down those key elements that are important to document conformance. It also is up to the individual. You don't want to rely on your memory. You do want to take notes, but there are things that you may be able to remember just by a keyword. You can write a keyword down and that will trigger you to remember when you're reflecting on your notes later, what is that other information that needs to be added into that. Effective note-taking during an interview, yes, it is hard to keep eye contact and capture everything you need. And I find that when you're standing with somebody and you're writing down notes, they think you're writing negative things. They tend to go to the negative every time. So I carry a clipboard. I've got wrist issues, so I use a clipboard to hold my notes. And I will show them that, I've got these boxes I need to fill in on this checklist or the requirements, and I need to put in the information that says that you're conforming to them. Again, somebody commented glass full versus glass empty. Yes, telling them, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm writing down all those positive things that show that you're conforming to these requirements. And if there's an area where you're not, well, then we'll discuss that. But really just letting them know that you are going to be taking notes, what your notes mean, and making eye contact while they're speaking, and then take that time to write down what they said after they're finished speaking.
Wonderful, thank you. Next one, how to approach a group during auditing. Not to target only one individual, especially if one is more dominant and might not represent the entire area of the process you're auditing.
Yes, I keep saying it. These are really good questions, but that is a challenge when you're in a group and there may be one person that wants to speak more than others. I will just do the redirection again. So if I ask a question of an individual and somebody else starts answering it, I'll let them speak to some degree, but then I'll go back to the person I was originally talking to and saying, now, what is your take on this? What is your response? I'd like to hear your input into this. There are times where you just have to ask that person to not answer the questions. And this sometimes happens with management. They'll want to answer the questions rather than let their personnel do it. And sometimes you just have to pull them aside and say, hey, I'm here to audit the personnel, the people doing the work. I know you know the job really well and you're proud of what they do. So let them shine, let them answer the questions. But you would want to have that conversation privately with that person and not call them out in front of the whole group.
Thank you. Next one. I'm an introvert and I feel that I am awkward when interacting with others, in that I don't know how to start the conversation. Do you have any good openers?
Yes, there are a lot of ways to feel more comfortable when you're performing an audit or assessment of an individual one-on-one. It can be awkward because you're there asking them questions about what they do, and sometimes they'll feel like, why do I need to tell you what I do? I know what I'm doing. But you can try to use self-disclosure. So that wasn't actually in this presentation, but we teach our assessors to use self-disclosure as a way to start the conversation. So you may walk up to somebody's workspace and see a picture of a dog, And you can say, oh, you have a dog, I have a dog. And you can talk for a few minutes, not a long time because you have an audit to complete. You can talk about dogs or what they did over the weekend or an upcoming holiday or something that is innocuous enough, but it kind of brings out the people side of both of you. So you get a little more comfortable talking with each other, and then you can have that conversation for the interview. I do want to make the comment for interviews, we don't want them to feel like interrogations. A good interview will feel like a conversation. So you'll start off with a question, they'll start talking, you'll have a follow-up question, and by the time you're done, they've given you all the information you need, but they don't feel like they're sitting under a hot lamp getting peppered with questions left and right.
Okay. And somebody just put in a chat that you can also start off with, let's both take a deep breath.
Yes, that is also a good point. You can just say, let's take a deep breath, or let's take a second, but introduce yourself, have them introduce themselves. When we do our training online and we do our introductions, we all disclose a fun fact about ourselves because that just kind of breaks the ice. So there's a lot of different ways to do it.
Okay, next question. Typically nod is to demonstrate understanding. In some situation, I'm thinking this is appropriate, but during an assessment, I am concerned that it may give the wrong perception. That is, they may take it as to mean that they're in conformance and that everything is good when in fact it may not be. Do you have any suggestion whether to nod or not to nod during an assessment?
That is a good point, and we did actually have this come up last week in our lead assessor class because we had individuals from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Germany, and so we were talking about those social conventions, those cultural conventions, and in some areas nodding means no, so you wouldn't want to nod. So you need to be aware of that, but you can nod to demonstrate understanding as they're speaking, even if there's a nonconformity. You're encouraging them to continue talking. So you're not nodding to say yes. You're nodding to say, I hear what you're saying, continue to speak. I don't have another question right now. So that's really more of what that nod is. Obviously, you don't want to have a big smile on your face and nodding and going, yeah, that's great. If it is a nonconformity, you just need to balance that.
Awesome. I have two questions, but I think they will require the same answer. So I'm going to ask them both at the same time. Do you have any suggestions on how to improve soft skills without actually performing an audit? As well as, do you have any specific recommendations for books or webcasts that you have used to improve soft skills?
So yeah, there are ways to improve your soft skills without performing an audit or an assessment. You can actually use these soft skills on your friends and family. Think about how you're interacting with your friends or family as you gather together. So you can do that. You can also, there's a wealth of information, just Googling soft skills. There are so many different good resources. As far as books, I don't have one in specific that I would use. I used quite a few to put together this presentation, just looking on the internet, but there are ways to do that. The other ways that you can hone your soft skills is by getting a mentor. If there's somebody that you know, a colleague or a friend that is really good at talking to people or is really good at taking notes or writing, then ask them to mentor you. Ask them to show you some of their tips and tricks on how they got to where they are. So those are just some of the ways.
Awesome. Next question. At what stage do you tell them that there is a nonconformity? Do you wait until the end of the audit or as soon as you determine there is a nonconformity?
As soon as you determine there is a nonconformity. If it's a team, then the team assessor or auditor should talk to the lead, but the lead should tell them as soon as they believe there's a nonconformity. And it can even be phrased as, this is potentially a nonconformity. We need to look at the objective evidence and the requirement and see if it really is, or if maybe it's an opportunity for improvement. But From ANAB's perspective, we disclose that as soon as we see that something could be nonconforming. And I do, as an assessor, if I'm chasing an audit trail, if I'm going down a path where I think there might be one, I will let them know to say, I'm going to need more information here to determine conformance, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to determine the conformance, and in that process, we may see that something is nonconforming.
Wonderful, Melanie. Thank you. I don't have any more questions coming in, so I'll give it a couple of more minutes. But before we'll end for the day, I want to give you some of the contact information. If you would like any additional information about training offered by ANAB, you can contact us at training@anab.org. If you have any questions about accreditation or the services ANAB provides related to accreditation, contact ANAB@anab.org. And finally, if any of you are ready to wanted to get an accreditation quote for any of the services that ANAB provides, you can contact Roger Muse at rmuse@anab.org. I don't see any more questions that have come in. I would like to thank you, Melanie, for giving this wonderful webinar. And I would like to thank everybody online who has provided wonderful questions. I did get a note just saying that it looks like I'm the only one on the webinar. We did have 25 people on this webinar. We try not to show the names of our participants as we had issues with people asking about who was from what organizations. So because of that, we have stopped sharing who participates. Other than that, you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll talk to you at some other time.
Thank you, everyone.